Welcome to Trinity Talks, today's news, tomorrow's leaders. Today, Trinity Talks, the US election. My name is Samuel, and I'm joined here today with
Matthew
and
Hello.
So, before we get into it, as we know, Donald Trump has won, but let's have a look into the past. Let's look into the background of the candidates. So, Matthew, could you give us a brief background of Kamala Harris before this election, considering she wasn't even supposed to run, as well as former President Donald Trump?
Sure. So first we have Vice President Kamala Harris running on the Democratic ticket. Harris's career began in California, where she served as a district attorney and later as California's Attorney General. In 2016, she was elected to the US Senate, where she gained a reputation for her sharp questioning style, especially during hearings involving members of the Trump administration. In 2020, she ran for the Democratic presidential nomination, but exited the race before the primaries.
I think it's worth mentioning as well that something that's particularly useful when we're talking about Kamala Harris is noting her time as prosecutor. Her time in court is something she particularly uses at rallies to infuse her supporters. She has one memorable quote from the campaign trail where she even stated that she, quote unquote, knows people like Trump. This is to say criminals, and it's something that she's used as part of her record to really bolster her campaign as a real talking point as part of her career. She's also used it to combat issues and attacks from Republicans on migration, saying that as her term as a lawyer, she also dealt with migration cases, so she knows how the law works and she knows how to deal with this if she were to become president, which now we know she didn't.
Then there is the Republican candidate, former President Donald Trump. He is positioning himself as the answer to what he calls a failing America. His 2024 platform, like his 2016 and 2020, centers on nationalism, a hardline immigration stance, and skepticism of government institutions that he claims have unfairly targeted him. Trump also faces many legal challenges, which we'll cover later, but his base remains strong in the right-hand side of America.
I feel like we all know Trump. I feel a big part of him is one of the most controversial figures in US politics. He's got a very big personality. He's very, very divisive, but that's something that while it polarizes a lot of voters, his supporters really, really love. Lots of people really like it, and his kind of straight-talking truth and facts. While he is a very polarizing figure, for a lot of us who might dislike him, we might have strong opinions over him, it's definitely sure that he has a strong MAGA voter base, which he relies on and gets a lot of vote for lots of elections.
Yeah, I agree. I think another thing that really pushed him forward back in 2016, for example, and I think again this year, is the fact that he isn't actually a politician. He's a businessman, and I just think that that's one of the main reasons that swayed people to actually vote for him. But let's move on. Me personally, I think that the main topics around this election was the economy. Both Trump and Kamala, they had strong stances on the economy, but what do you guys think?
I'd have to agree with you on that. I feel like what we've heard a lot from Trump is this idea of how were you 4 years ago? Like, how was your pocket 4 years ago? How did you feel 4 years ago financially? Where, in his opinion, the economy was much stronger, which, according to all the data and statistics, it was. The employment rate maybe was lower, but inflation was a lot more stable and a lot lower. Taxes were sort of semi-lower, but we're still under Donald Trump's tax code. But anyway, I'd say the economy is always a big concern in pretty much any election. Biden's administration points to data showing unemployment at historic lows now, sitting around 3.6% as of last month, while average wages have continued to rise. However, inflation, which spiked post-COVID, is still an issue for many families, and recent Fed hikes in interest rates, which they've started to bring down now, have made borrowing for homes and cars a bit more expensive.
Yeah, I definitely think it's really interesting, the economy in this election. I think there's two main kind of things that we see from the campaign specifically, that have been used to combat this. I think the first is the extent to which Biden's bad handling economy has actually impacted Kamala Harris's campaign. This is where I think we see, particularly on the economy and also on issues like migration, we see Kamala Harris try to distance herself from Biden's administration and trying to distance herself from the bad handling.
Yeah.
But note as well that this is a thing that Trump clearly pushes, and we know that in his rallies he pushes a lot of, under my presidency you felt better and your life was better than it was years ago. But note that there are some parts of the US economy that are doing well, things like inflation, parts of Biden's investment, and while there is some economic issues that are still prevalent, I don't feel like the economy is the issue that really decides this election, because it's one that people are quite split on. I think there's other issues that are more important, but I think the second thing that it really does is it allows Trump's rhetoric of making America great again and his kind of economic stance to really, really push home. I think this is where, not to get too technical, but to go back to the 2016 election, we saw Trump pushing a huge platform of bringing industry back to America. So note that at that time, due to trade deals like NAFTA, which led to different American companies moving abroad and offshoring, he's tried to bring those industry back through things like tariffs and through different economic policies. Whether they work or not, that's debatable. But he's particularly been able to push that this election and to say that we need to bring industry back. And that's like a message that hits home for a lot of these like Midwestern, like industry, non-college educated voters who really, really have seen their life harmed while industry moves abroad. So that's a big part of this election. Those voters he targets in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, who rely and have a lot of that type of industry.
But let me ask you this. This year, according to lots of like the polling data that we got after the election, and even now that we're receiving more information about the votes, we've actually seen Trump do much better amongst people that are college educated, and obviously perform better as well among people that weren't college educated as well. So how do you think that he was able to appeal to those people that are college educated, that maybe have a better education than others?
I think this is quite interesting because there are many demographic groups in this election that Harris and Democrats usually win, but Trump was able to cut significant shares into them. I think it's quite interesting the way Trump's able to do this. I think he appeals to this in two ways. I think the first is by, like, note that the economy isn't necessarily the only issue that these voters cares about. So this is where we say they're intersectional. So note that when we say, like, college-educated graduates and, like, non-college educated, employment might not be the main thing they care about. Like, note they might care about other issues like democracy, which was one of the top ones we saw in the exit polls as being like something that's important, and issues like immigration. So some of these other issues that Trump, and note Republicans really banked on, like immigration was a huge part of the Trump campaign. That might be where some of these voters are won, and also on other like economic policies. I think this is particularly relevant when looking at swing states, because across the board in the like these national exit polls, I think we see these kind of trends. But in states like North Carolina, for example, we saw the economy was actually a much higher indicator of the way people voted than in other areas. So across the country, we saw a lot of other factors being at play. But in like states like North Carolina and some of those more like Rust Belt states, we saw the economy was more important. But in the Sun Belt states as well, we saw that immigration was particularly important, because those are some of the states who are near the border with Mexico. So I think that's something that really influenced this election as far as the issues that affected different areas. But Trump was able to win in both, which I think is unique, because he, like, the main focus of the Republican campaign was economic issues, which is important to Rust Belt states, and immigration issues, which is important to Sun Belt. So in that way, I think they were able to mobilize voters in different groups in both areas.
All right. Well, I know we've already slightly talked about it, but let's talk about the actual campaigning and the actual lead up to the election. So, for example, the fact that Biden dropping out early means that, do you guys think Kamala might have been slightly disadvantaged?
I think what we were talking about earlier, actually, about Nancy Pelosi and what she's recently said, I think you probably want to talk about that since you brought it up earlier.
Yeah, I was definitely shocked at the headlines. I woke up this morning, looked at my phone, saw an article that Nancy Pelosi criticised Biden and said that if Biden had dropped out the race sooner, then Kamala would have had a better chance to run. I think this is really important to talk about, because Nancy Pelosi is like a stronghold, a Democrat. She's been Speaker of the House for years at this point, and she's a real heavy hitter, big name in the Democrat Party. So for her to go out and say that is quite like impactful compared to some of the lower level people and, you know, Democrats that we've seen saying this. So I think it's important here, because I think not only does it, like, this is I think a debate that we'll have, whether if Biden had dropped out the race sooner, whether it would have given Kamala a better chance. But I think a key takeaway from this that we shouldn't forget is that it is foreboding for what's coming forward. Many political analysts and scientists have predicted that there might be some Democrat infighting following this election, a kind of change of direction. We might see, as with other losses, you know, different primary candidates arising. Note that in elections beforehand, we had Bernie Sanders really
populist,
become popular in the Democrat Party. We might see a resurgence of candidates like that. I'm not saying necessarily Bernie Sanders, but other candidates who try to pull the Democrat Party further to the left. and try to like infuse a more liberal base. I think that's really something to look forward to in the years following this election, the way that the Democrat Party changes and the way it reforms itself to get into the next campaign. I think we're seeing a sign of the infighting that's possibly to come.
Yeah, I think something that Trump did fantastically was to fight on the idea that like Sleepy Joe has fallen out of the race and now it's a one-way road, like a motorway to the victory basically. Like he was able to give voters the idea, like his fans or his supporters, that it's like an easy path from here, that we're going to just drive through, vote early, and I think that's something that we should talk about, definitely, about early voting this year, something that the Republicans have really pressed upon. I've seen something recently on a YouTube video from a news channel called Tangle, who went to Bucks County in Pennsylvania, where there was allegations of voter fraud and and corruption in voting, where a polling station was closed earlier than it's legally allowed to be closed, which held back a lot of Democrats who lived in rural areas around Bucks County from not being able to vote, which then subsequently Trump's group sued the state and won and reopened the polling station for an extra 3 days. So I think that victory was something that Trump played upon, saying that the Democrats are trying to stop us from voting and that everybody needs to go out and vote early before they try and shut all of the polling stations down like they've done in Bucks County. And it's something that we've never really seen before in an election.
I think it's really interesting because I think it presents almost... I saw this as well, obviously, with there were headlines of different polling stations, different polling booths. I saw one particular one where actually it was like a voter box or votes box, a ballot box, and it was like burnt, right? And all the votes
were
like singed. I think it's really interesting for two reasons. The first, I think, I don't know how much impact it has on the election results, but I think the impact of it is like the discrediting of the US elections. I think is like damaging as a whole. We all know obviously the insurrection on
January 6th
after Trump lost the election last election cycle. I think it's really interesting seeing that becoming more mainstream in American politics. I think it's something that we should bring up, and we'll probably talk about later as far as Trump's different assassination attempts. But I think that violence or that kind of damaging rhetoric in American politics has become more and more common as far as calling out like voter fraud and that kind of that type of politics. I think it's something that we're going to see more prevalent, but perhaps it will change after Trump's next term and after we see maybe some other Republican candidate take office and run for the next election.
So, yeah, I completely agree. Sticking on that topic of the actual election process and the campaigns, and you talking about the assassination attempt, sorry, that's it. One of those was an October surprise. Now, for those that don't know, an October surprise it happens pretty much every single election. The election is usually the first Thursday of November, and there's always something that happens in the October before that really affects the election. So, for example, Hurricane Helene became a major political talking point, with Harris and Trump both visiting the affected areas to highlight their disaster response policies. But also, one thing that I thought was quite unexpected was Elon Musk's financial support for the conservative groups backing Trump. There was a lot of media scrutiny with that, where there was a point where I think, Elon was promising to pay people $1 million each for signing up to a website and voting.
Elon was promising a kind of sweepstakes for voters who registered where you could enter it and win £1 million. It got challenged in the Supreme Court. It was quite, reading news articles on it, it was kind of a soap opera. I believe that Elon Musk was allowed to do that.
He was. Yeah.
Loopholes. That's what
he won the case.
And I think this is interesting because it links to a lot of a historic kind of way campaigns are funded. A lot of it, and the perception of it from the public can be a lot of the time. It is quite shady and quite unknown. In America, the reason why this is the case is because different groups are allowed to fund campaigns almost to an unlimited extent because of their First Amendment rights. So it's seen as free speech, them being able to give their money. I think the important thing here then is saying that, I think going forward, and we've seen this in super PACs and the rise of PACs, but I think people funding elections and these huge kind of millionaires and people who are able to have huge influence on elections, I think it is something that's here to stay and it's not just a one-time trend.
Yeah, and I'd say something else that I found quite interesting throughout this election, kind of going off the October surprises, but the use of social media from both candidates has been something that we've never ever seen before, apart from really in 2016 and 2020, when obviously everyone was kind of locked indoors, apart from 2016, which was something that Trump did that was uniquely different to Hillary Clinton. He really went on a spree on Twitter and just sort of bombarded his message on Twitter and all these different social media sites.
There was a rumor that for the TikTok page, and all of the things Donald Trump did, going on the Joe Rogan podcast and meeting Adrian Ross, apparently the megamind behind that was actually his son, Barron Trump.
Exactly, that was what I was going to come to. Now we're seeing that's been sort of flowing across the news.
Not so sure about
Don't know exactly the truthfulness of that, but it kind of shows how now his organization and his administration, if you'd call it, are trying to sort of mobilize the youth. As we've known, there's been quite a exactly. There's been quite a lack of people going out that are young and voting. Pretty much across the world, a lot of people feel quite disenfranchised in politics at the moment. So I think that's something quite unique that the Democrats have done. But going back to Elon Musk, for that the $1 million thing, he opened his own PAC called America PAC. So I guess that shows literally how he is directly funding Trump and his campaign, which ended up winning.
Yeah, and I'm aware that Elon Musk PAC invested a lot of money into Trump's campaign, and obviously as well, just note that Trump did also promise Elon Musk a place in his administration. Whether or not this will be acted upon, and whether or not Trump will actually do this is waiting to be seen. But we can definitely see that someone like Elon Musk has had a lot of influence in politics. I just wanted to pick up on this point of podcast, and I think that it's really important because I think in this election, I think it is something that we also will see going forward, but I think particularly this election is a real showcase of that, is that we saw both candidates really go out of their way to use unconventional media to try to attract people and get in touch with people who maybe otherwise wouldn't listen to politics. So we know that Republicans and Trump went on lots of different podcasts, Joe Rogan podcasts, he went on a podcast with Undertaker to try to appeal to a younger, different audience and people who may not necessarily be engaged with politics. We saw Kamala Harris go on Call Her Daddy, which is a podcast, and a thing which I think both of these candidates are trying to do is access people who aren't already decided, these undecided voters who might not go out and vote. They're trying to get them engaged, get them out and voting, and hopefully trying to get them to their side. I think while this is a similarity between the two candidates, their use of unconventional media, I think the difference in the way they use it is that in Trump's campaign, and a big part of it was focusing on trying to get youth voters. So it was specifically focused on young men specifically. There was a large amount, even at Trump's campaigns, the Republican convention, he had, I forgot his name, Hulk Hogan on the
ripping his
shirt. You can tell from an outside perspective that a lot of this is definitely aimed at young men. Even with Trump's assassination attempts, the kind of way he tried to use it is calling himself a fighter, and that iconic photo which I know we might not have all seen, but if you look at it online, the one of him holding his fist up and fight being a slogan that said it's definitely aimed at appealing to young men. I think that Harris's use of unconventional media is less focused around young men and more focused on interacting with women, on particularly I think the issue of abortion and trying to get them out to vote on that. I think this is particularly important because in the polls and in different polling, different data, we see that abortion is an issue that women specifically care a lot about. Harris has been able to really focus on this issue and try to get women to vote on that issue. The reason why this is important is note that when we're talking about women as voters, they also have the same interests as other different groups of voters. So if they vote on the economy, they have more of a chance of voting for someone like Trump. If they vote on issues like immigration, they have more of a chance of voting on someone like Trump. So a lot of the Harris campaign, as far as their use of unconventional media, was trying to move the conversation or move what voters are voting on away from those issues which Donald Trump is strong on and towards the issues which Democrats are strong on, like abortion and their stance on abortion. So by trying to move the election and by trying to move the goalposts to those areas, I think the Harris campaign was able to be somewhat successful in getting women out to vote on the issue of abortion in different states. But the reason why this ultimately didn't matter, I think, in the election and why it didn't really help the election result is because a lot of these women who voted for the Democrats in issues like abortion weren't in the swing states that matters. This is where we say that a lot of these voters exist in areas like California, different states that
Which
traditionally
already blue,
vote Democrat, places like New York. So the reason why this might have not helped actually in the polls, and if we look, we see that like in swing states, while Kamala did win more of the female vote than Trump, it wasn't enough to put her over in those states. I think it's because simply while focusing on these issues nationally, and you might get national support, what really matters in American elections, and I think it's all a good thing for all of us to take into account, is it's really all about those swing states. That's what determines the winner of these American elections.
Okay. Slightly moving away from the campaigns, but at the same time still on topic. What do you guys think about the vice presidential picks from each candidate? So, as we know, for Kamala, she picked Tim Walz, and Donald Trump, the now, well, soon-to-be vice president, J.D. Vance, the youngest ever vice president so far, I'm pretty sure. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I'll talk about Walz because I actually had reservations about when this pick was made. I understand why. I think that Walz was picked, for those who don't know, I'll cue you in on the podcast. Walz was picked because he introduced a new kind of marketing or new kind of rhetoric around the Democratic campaign. It was quite simple. Basically what he did is he started calling Trump and like characterizing Trump and Vance and these Republicans as like weird. And while it's quite simple, the kind of, use of the word weird, right, obviously, it's something that particularly in this election was something that really changed the way Democrats talk about like Trump and Vance, because up until that point, the Democratic rhetoric had been quite extreme, as kind of calling them authoritarian or calling them like extremists and that kind of thing. From moving that bit away from that and towards, calling these people weird and saying that, they're the kind of people who like are just, ruin family gatherings, things like that. That rhetoric really changed the election, and that's why he was brought on.
So, what do you guys think about the vice presidential picks from each candidate this year? So, Kamala, as we know, picked Tim Walz, and Donald Trump picked the new soon-to-be vice president, J.D. Vance, who is the youngest vice president.
So let's talk about J.D. Vance, and I want to talk in particular about the transformation that he's had, because this is like probably one of the most fascinating part of the election for me. So here we have a guy who started out as a vocal Trump critic, publicly criticizing a lot of what Trump represented. But then what we see is a big change, particularly in 2022, where he decided to run for the Senate. His tune started to change quite dramatically, and his shift from a skeptic to full-on supporter of Trump, I think, was not coincidental at all. He completely aligns with the sort of idea of MAGA and completely shifts his complete mentality towards Trump and MAGA to get that position in the Senate, in my opinion. You looked at me a bit weird there, Killer. What do you think?
Because I'm interested. A lot of critics of Vance obviously would say that they'd call him a political opportunist. They'd say that he was someone who was really vocal of Trump, but as soon as the winds changed, as soon as it looked like Trump was going to, become the candidate again and, fight in elections and possibly win, because we saw in a lot of polls it was close, that he suddenly changed his tune dramatically and he came out to propose Trump. So is that something that you would agree with then?
100%. I think that was really his plan from the beginning, from 2022. And now that he was running again, and now that he could sort of get in on that support, and I think he's sort of like the sort of, in the opinion of MAGA and sort of the main base of the Republicans at the moment, like the next in command for when Trump sort of puts the sword down, that he will be the next person to sort of take MAGA to the next level or to continue on Trump's legacy as their great martyr of republicanism.
I find it really interesting that you say that, because I think it is really interesting to talk about these people who surround Trump, because a lot of time we think about like MAGA, or it's actually called America First. I've heard that name used a lot. We mainly think of Trump as like the spearheaded leader of it, but it's also important to say there's other kind of wings of it that exist, and there's other different people. I think a person I like to mention here, because I saw them on a podcast recently, is you might remember Vivek Ramaswamy from the Republican debates. He's gone out of his way a lot to make a lot of different like journal articles, posts, trying to outline what exactly America First looks like. And I think while I'd explain that on a lot of issues, his version of America First is actually quite different from Trump's, but it's based a lot more around it's based a lot more around Republican values. So by this, I think there's two main ones I'll pick out. But obviously, there's other things. I'm just like paraphrasing because I don't want to go straight. Like I don't want to do too much of a deep dive into America First ideology. But the first is a kind of nationalist element, which is say that of being American, and that kind of is the backbone of the kind of their foreign policy as well as their immigration policy of kind of what it means to be American, or like being American being something that's important to their kind of ideology. I think the second is this kind of economic idea of focusing on America and rather than other countries. So this is kind of where the ideas of having tariffs, or not, if not tariffs, at least levers that you can pull to get other countries to do what you want as far as economically, and this is like bringing industry back. I think while those two things are consistent inside of America First, inside of Trump, within that kind of Trump bubble and like MAGA bubble, you have a lot of different figures like Vivek Ramaswamy and like J.D. Vance who have differing views. I think if you wanted to look at J.D. Vance's views, I think something that's really interesting that he's done is he has his book called, do you remember what it's called? Hillbilly Elegy.
Yeah.
Where he's written about it and his experiences of what it's like to live in, I believe, the Midwest where he grew up. And he was very negative about the Midwest. He called it a kind of cycle of dysfunction that people didn't aim to improve their lives, and he was very negative about it as far as like a lack of ingenuity, a lack of creativeness, a lack of wanting to move on. So he argues that that's why he's based a lot of his politics around these kind of right-wing ideas of like working yourself and moving up and like not having state intervention, kind of being very self-sufficient in that type of way. I think that these views are really interesting when we're talking about Trump, because while Trump has his own views, and like whether or not like people like Vivek Ramaswamy are going to be able to control Trump and kind of actually even have a say in the presidency, which like I would actually bet that they don't, because I think Trump's such a like dominant figure in the kind of Republican Party and in the like executive that these people aren't probably going to be able to get a word in edgeways. But I think that it's really interesting to talk about these like different parts of the Republican Party, because while we look at the Republican Party and we see Trump, like behind that kind of first image, a really diverse Republican Party still exists. Like, note, this is the Republican Party that does have like a range of ideologies, a range of views. There are a lot of different senators and like governors inside the Republican Party that have different opinions on lots of different things. While they have all moved like over to the right more because of polarization, there are still like a lot of Republicans who are very like quite far away from each other on the political spectrum.
Okay, now I think something that everyone is talking about who's been following this election, the international reaction. How do you guys think global leaders responded to the campaign? So for me personally, I think Harris was the preferred candidate for a lot of her allies. Her policies on climate change and diplomacy align well with a lot of European countries and many parts of Asia as well. Many leaders actually viewed her as a way to restore stronger international partnerships, whereas Trump's approach was about independence and maintaining that independence. His like MAGA stance, or America First stance, is polarizing, but his supporters see it as a sign of strength. Some leaders, especially in countries with conservative governments, such as like Putin and stuff, appreciate the independence.
I'd actually like to kind of stop you here, because I found that quite interesting. With Russia, in fact, like specifically that example of Putin, he actually didn't say anything, or like purposely didn't congratulate Trump on the election. I think this kind of is a changing of rhetoric, possibly between the relationship between Russia and America, because I think while obviously during Trump's first term there was a slight warming of relations towards Russia and like Putin, Russia and like the Kremlin kind of spokespeople have made clear that they like don't really care about who wins this election, and they've kind of kept a really neutral stance. There's kind of, if you look online, you'll find funny quotes from the Kremlin spokesperson where they've kind of said that Putin didn't stay up and like he just went to sleep and like he didn't watch the election results the next day and things like that. I think it's really interesting talking about this relationship between Russia and America, because I think while it's built, like, a lot of people have said that a Trump presidency means the kind of the cuddling up with Russia and the kind of it being very kind of tight knit and close. I actually don't think that's what we're going to see. I think while Trump is going to seek an end to the Ukraine war, which I think is the main issue that the Russia and the US conflict on and is the key thing at the moment, I think even like among Ukrainian diplomats, I think there's kind of two ways that will happen. I think the first is either that Trump like demands Ukraine to give up territory to Russia, and in that case, it's hugely damaging for not only Ukraine but for a lot of allies and people in like countries in Europe that have been supporting Ukraine really stalwartly up until this point. Or Trump puts the kind of squeeze on Putin and pushes Putin to try to accept a kind of compromise by pulling multiple different levers that he has in foreign policy. I think that while a Trump presidency for many before this election is very scary when it comes to looking at the Ukraine war, and lots of people might have the perspective that if Trump comes to power, that means that Putin's just going to I think that in reality, while like it is definitely not a good thing Trump being in power for Ukraine, because Biden and like Kamala's support is very strong for Ukraine. I think that it isn't necessarily as bad as people say. I don't think it's the end for Ukraine necessarily, and I think we'll have to wait and see what happens on that front to see how Trump handles the Ukraine war. I think that's one of the things that we'll see from his presidency, and that will be judged on in his first couple of years in office.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, but also I'm just reading up on this BBC News article just a few days ago. Although it wasn't a formal congratulations, Putin did say at an event at the Russian city of Sochi, he said that he congratulated Donald Trump and called him a courageous man, and when asked if he was ready to have discussions, Putin replied that they're ready. So what do you have to say about that?
I think it's quite interesting. I think the relationship between Russia and the USA will be something that we're looking at going forward. I think intentionally during the election campaign, because of the kind of television debates I found really interesting on this issue, because when questions about Russia and when questions about Putin would come up, we'd see from Kamala Harris a really strong kind of display of calling him a dictator, saying that we're going to fight against him, and saying that we're going to stand strong with our allies in Ukraine. And then kind of Trump would almost avoid the topic, or not necessarily avoid the topic, but avoid calling Putin a dictator. He had a really different tone, and his kind of comments would mainly be around, we will end the war, and that was Trump's main message. He didn't, criticize Vladimir Putin. He didn't call him a dictator. He focused more on just ending the war, like fundamentally, as on its own. So I think that's the main thing we'll see. I think that the relationship between America and Russia is not going to be a like buddy camaraderie run. Like we're not going to see, Russia and the USA being like on good terms and very friendly. I think that's like on a foreign policy level. I don't think that's something that we're going to see happen. I think what we're much more likely to see happen is a kind of a mutual relationship between them, and I think it's going to be quite icy going forward. I don't see it like thawing and having kind of a golden age of relations like the one which we arguably saw under Trump's first presidency. I think it looks massively different this time around because of the Ukraine war and because of kind of Russia's actions in Ukraine and the USA standing against that. I think USA, like, while not being as hard on Russia as it was under Biden, I don't think it's going to take a complete swing and suddenly be really supportive of the Kremlin regime.
I'd like to come off the topic of Russia and come a bit close to home with the UK, and now with our own sort of semi-new government and how they've sort of reacted and responded. And I think something we've really seen that's quite interesting, in my opinion, is the response, particularly from Keir Starmer and from David Lammy. And what's in particular interesting about David Lammy is his comments in 2017 when Donald Trump first came to the UK, where he called Donald Trump a white supremacist and a neo-Nazi. Yeah. And now he's gone like completely back from that and congratulated him from winning, which is something I think that the new Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch has played upon really well in the recent Prime Minister's questions from last week, where she sort of called them out and said, is he happy to stand here and apologise for the comments he made about Trump? And similar from Keir Starmer, we've seen sort of quite a friendly response from him, congratulating Trump. And even Zelensky himself wrote like a good 6 paragraphs on Twitter about how fantastic Trump was and how interesting and how much of a great guy he was. I remember him writing on Twitter like, "Oh, I remember our meetings in September 2020 and how fantastic our relations have been." So it's quite interesting to see how like leaders from countries which are maybe now a bit more left-leaning than they were a few years ago, like particularly in the UK, have responded to Trump becoming president again.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It's funny how people, when the political power shifts and when Trump is the new president,
their tone
they completely change their tone. Now they all love Trump, right? I think this is just part and parcel of like Trump coming into power. I think we see this throughout like presidential history that countries try to have good relations with the USA just as like it being important to their foreign policy. I think it's definitely an issue for like some countries. So note in the UK is like a great example where people like David Lammy and Keir Starmer as well had made comments about how, you know, Trump presidency is bad for the UK. But obviously, like as a part of the UK's foreign policy stance, their attitude around Trump presidency changes. I think this is like something that you just definitely see with like different, you know, presidents coming in. We saw like a meal happen between we saw Keir Starmer go to Mar-a-Lago, Trump's kind of resort. I think that generally in responding to presidential elections, countries try to build relations with both candidates because they know that it can go either way. And particularly in this election, like looking at the polls in different states, like we all knew that it could go either way. So I think countries do try to maintain good relations with each. And we can see that definitely after the election, countries have made effort. I think a good example of this, and I think it really captures this point, is with an interview with Zelensky, and they asked him about what a Trump presidency would mean for Ukraine, and his kind of cagey response was that he said that it would be hard work, but that we are hard workers. I think that line kind of captures the stance that different countries have on foreign policy as far as towards America, where I think for a lot of countries, and like very clearly, a Trump presidency is bad for them. Like, no, I think specifically to do with Trump's rhetoric on tariffs, where he's argued like imposing a huge.
Yeah.
Do you remember the figure?
I think it was 20% tariffs on every single import into the UK, US.
Or like all goods. No, for like lots, like I don't even like lots of countries around the world. This looks particularly bad, right? We say that like for a lot of countries, a Trump presidency is bad for this like one reason. But we say that even despite this, and even despite perhaps all of, you know, the comments in the past about how Trump's so bad, about, you know, he did this, we'll definitely see, you know, like David Lammy having dinner with Trump in the future and kind of, you know, having those kind of good relations with America.
One of the things that I find, just quickly to finish off that point, is quite difficult to track all these figures that he's throwing out. Because there'll be like an interview where he says, we're going to put a 1,000% tariff on China. And then he'll go the next day to like Bloomberg and say, it will be 200% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. So he kind of throws around all of these sort of like very rough and kind of big figures to sort of stand out in that sort of rhetoric of, oh, we're going to be like anti-China, we're going to be America first, and very strongly for American infrastructure and for their industry in particular.
I kind of see where you're coming from. I think I disagree. I think it's a bit exaggerated. But I do think the important thing when talking about this kind of policy that Trump has, and I think there is like two impacts of this, is that I think the first, and I actually wanted to just talk about this, is during the election campaign, there was this think tank that made a list of Trump policies. Do you remember this? Where it was, they were basically saying what Trump's policies for the presidential campaign should be, and he was kind of distancing himself from
Project
that.
2025.
Yeah, Project 2025. And he was saying that no, these aren't going to be like, these aren't Republican policies, these aren't going to be the policies I enact. I feel like there has been some confusion in this election about what policies Trump actually is pushing and like which ones are being pushed by the Republican Party or by like these other groups. I think that while it is important to be clear that these are separate, like likely these policies in this think tank like will have some influence on policy. I definitely think so at least. I think the second thing is saying that these different figures, like I think part of the reason why they look different to Trump and why like other people say different ones is because of the like character in Trump. I think this is really interesting, like linking back to the part where we talked about different figures around Trump, like Vivek Ramaswamy, like J.D. Vance. They will probably be more moderate with their estimates as far as, you know, the tariff policy. They'll say that it's like 10%, 20% because we don't want to do this. And then you'll hear Trump at a rally be like, we're going to, you know, tax the Chinese and we're going to like, you know, impose huge tariffs on them. I think that this is where under the Trump presidency, I think we'll see like a huge issue of like how to control Trump. And in a sense, I mean that as far as Trump as a political figure being like very, you know, headstrong, very kind of brash and abrasive, very kind of controversial. I think they will have to see a lot of figures around Trump try to kind of get him to be at least more moderate, at least more politically effective, rather than being really brash, really harsh, imposing like huge tariffs on countries. And I think that's something that we definitely saw under his first presidency. While it's something that listeners might not know, multiple different people who worked with Trump in the White House have come out and said what it's like being in the Trump presidency. Lots of them said that it was, to like quote one person, obviously this is a person that like wasn't very kind of Trump, they argued it to being similar to like trying to look after a toddler in the White House, and they had to like guide him as to what to do. I think it's definitely something that we'll see going forward in this Trump presidency. The ability and the effectiveness of different figures around Trump to control him, and whether or not Trump can be controlled. Like, no, under Trump's first presidency, we saw crazy decisions like, many people may remember this, the ban on Muslims coming into America, and different decisions which were not, like, arguably not good for America, and like were quite arbitrary and brash. I think we will see possibly decisions like this going forward, and I think the way the Trump presidency will be judged is on the ability of Trump to be actually make more like measured decisions and more of the right decisions, rather than really appealing to this right-wing rhetoric of saying that we're going to, tax China by like 10,000%, for example.
Okay, so we're moving towards the end of the election, and our final topic of discussion. What do you guys think about the exit polls coming from the election?
Well, I think something we see particularly in America, and something that I spoke to you about Khalil, is about how extravagant they make their news channels and their exit polls. The way that they shoot up with like the American flag and eagles flying across the screen is just something that's like slightly off topic, but I think that's something fantastic that the Americans do. And then all of like the media personnel start like screaming and shouting about, oh my goodness, Donald Trump has won Pennsylvania or won this state or the other. Like I find that really cool about American politics, and something that makes it quite fun.
Next time we introduce the podcast, we'll have like a intro theme with like the American flag shooting and like eagles singing. Well, okay, other than that, then obviously the presentation of different American news channels and the kind of dramatic presentation. Looking at the actual exit polls, I think that before we even get into anything, I think the important thing to note, and the reason why like exit polls aren't necessarily even important or like are a useful thing, is because they're nationwide, right? This is to say that, exit polls which ask people about different issues, it measures them across the nation. I think that I'd recommend for people who like are genuinely interested in studying this election, rather than looking at like national election polls, I think really looking at individual swing states like Georgia, like Pennsylvania, looking at the results in those states and looking at the exit polls in those states are the ones that will really allow you to be able to understand the way this election went. Other than that, and like putting that to the side, I think that we saw something really interesting in this election, and as far as like key demographics specifically, and I think that we should have a discussion about firstly key demographics, and then secondly the kind of issues that were important to voters, and we already touched on that. I think with key demographics though, the main thing that I think was really, really interesting in this election was the ability of Trump to be able to cut in to the kind of democratic voter base that usually exists. So I think here we're talking about like African Americans and like Latino voters.
Yeah, so I'd say in particular for African American voters, which we see majority of them in major cities, places like in Georgia, like Atlanta, for example, that Trump was really able to sort of tap into that vote. And I saw a piece of news coverage from BBC America, particularly about Atlanta, and how Trump was sort of able to mobilize a new group of particularly young black American men that were in the middle of college or like leaving college to move on to build careers or become business owners or entrepreneurs. That's something that he really pushed, and I'd say that it was, in my opinion at least, his use of social media and sort of conservative speakers online. People like Charlie Kirk that go across universities and college campuses across America, even with people like we saw recently with Vivek Ramaswamy, who they both went there to debate with college students and university students in America, which is something that I think the Kamala campaign or the administration weren't really able to do, or didn't really do at all. They didn't really have many sort of...
They were definitely less successful.
Yeah, for 100%.
I think this is where, not to get really technical, but maybe I'm just a nerd when it comes to this, but I'm just really interested by, like, when it comes to this demographic change as far as the election. One article that I read, which I just really want to bring up, is an article from Zercher and the BBC, where they argued that basically the kind of demographic change that Democrats were expecting to be able to help them win this election, like, was failure and didn't happen. This is where, and this is like a narrative that I brought into, or like myself, that I believe, which is that the demographic change that's happening in America, note like this is there being more people who have different ethnic backgrounds, so there are more African Americans and like Latino Americans in America now, because of like immigration, and also there's an increasing voter base of people who are like college educated because of more people getting degrees.
Access, yeah.
And because more people getting that. like lots of political scientists have said that going forward, this likely means that Democrats will be more successful in elections. Like that, there's a kind of march of time that will mean that eventually Democratic candidates that will eventually mean that Democratic candidates do better and are more successful at elections. Like, but this I think was destroyed at this election.
Yeah, like I was usually about to jump in there. I can sort of see why they would say that, but I'd kind of disagree. I think that would make that sort of increase in black, Asian, minority, ethnic voters in America through things like migration and just increase in birth rates is going to make elections much more dynamic in various different states. So see places like Georgia or like our swing states, I think what we're going to see over time is that's going to start to sort of develop into there being either more swing states or certain states in particular becoming even more important as time goes on.
I think definitely like the Latino vote specifically, I think this is something I really want to look at because Trump's victories in the Sunbelt states of places like Arizona was really, really important in this election and being able to win states with a like large Latino vote proportion. I think it's clear to like this is something that's important to say to our listeners. While if you were to look at the national election polls, like Kamala does still win these groups nationally.
100%.
Like Kamala and the Democrats do still win like more of the Latino vote than Trump does. They win a large portion of the African American vote. But what really changes this election is Trump's ability to be able to cut into this. No, like elections before, the one that we usually use as a talking point for this is the election, the election with Obama versus McCain, where McCain really struggled with figures of below 30% for these different demographic groups, like Latino groups, and with well below 10% for African American groups. Trump has been able to increase these margins by enough an extent to the point where he's able to like win these elections on the margins. And I think particularly with the Latino vote, like that is Trump being able to win that voter group and being able to cut into the Democrats like winning of that. I think is something that really helped Trump win these swing states, and that's why we've seen such a dominant victory
in those
Trump.
key swing states, which was what I was going to say.
Mm-hmm.
I think, okay, focusing a bit more on the Harris administration, I feel like what they tried to do, or attempted to try and do as hard as they could, is try and get the black vote. Like, for example, Kamala Harris would change her accent, depending on where she was. This became quite an internet meme. For example, priest Kamala, Jamaican Kamala, Latino Kamala, where she would change her accent depending on where she would be to try and, I guess, sort of relate to voters and kind of distance herself from the political, circle above. What do you guys think about this?
I think what we see in that is quite like a big, I'd say almost an injustice from the media, sort of the media targeting Kamala, saying that, or like social media in particular, her sort of quote unquote changing her accent or changing her demeanour towards like different voters. But then we see stuff similar from Trump, or things even more extreme from Trump, like we were talking about earlier, the comedian that said that Puerto Rico is like an island of garbage, and him getting obviously a bit of stick for it, but that barely affected the election, whereas sort of, Kamala, she's changing her accent, that shows that she's not like a legitimate person or that she's not genuine. I think it's quite an injustice for me from the media of them targeting Kamala, in my opinion.
This was something interesting that I looked at as well, because in the exit poll data on election day, there was a really interesting statistic about the amount of people who had decided, like when people had decided their vote, and it was something of upwards of 80%. I believe it was around 90% of people who had decided their vote before September. This is to say the issues that we like talk about a lot in the run-up to elections, like the calling Puerto Rico garbage, and also like Hurricane Helene. The extent to which they influence how people actually vote is really debatable. Like, they definitely do reach out. People like probably do hear these issues, but like whether it depends the like way people vote is something that's really hotly debated in these circles. So like we do have to take it with a pinch of salt when like we're talking about those kind of issues. I think that if we're focusing on the Kamala Harris campaign and then the Democrat campaign, I think the real issue that they had specifically, as far as the like demographic group they're targeting, is that I think they focused a lot on targeting and getting women out to vote, but they didn't vote in the force and in the numbers that Kamala Harris needed. There's a really interesting article on the BBC which kind of agreed with his views, but I think that by focusing on women and like by focusing their demographic group on like by focusing on that demographic group specifically, I feel like they kind of put all their eggs into one basket. So at the point where women didn't come out and vote in the force that they wanted, like, didn't like support Kamala Harris in that way, I think that it was quite damaging to their campaign because they eventually weren't able to get the votes needed. I think that the thing that I'd say that I think I would have improved from Kamala Harris' campaign is I think what she needed to do was focus on a broader coalition of voters, focus on the Latino voters that Trump's like quite strong on, and focus on like more broader demographic groups rather than focus on like specific demographics as part of the campaign. Because I think ultimately these groups are partially what cost the election, not coming out in enough force, and we saw that particularly with the demographic reform.
Well, thank you guys very much. I think that is it for today's episode of Trinity Talks. Thanks for joining us as we unpack the 2024 presidential election landscape. I've been Samuel, here with
Matthew.
Hello.
It's shaped up to be one of the most polarised and consequential elections in American history. So we'll leave you with that, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to Trinity Talks, today's news, tomorrow's leaders. This is the official podcast of Trinity Academy Brixton. Today's episode was written and recorded by Samuel, Kalel and Matthew. The editing was done by Miss Johnston. Make sure to tune in next week for another episode, and if you would like to get involved, please contact us via our email, socials@trinity.futureacademies.org. You can also follow us on social media at Trinity Brixton on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook, or at Trinity Academy Brixton on YouTube.